Good morning, everyone. Put your hand up if you've ever stood on the coast on a properly windy day in Scotland and thought, right, there's enough wind here to power half the country. That feeling is basically the whole idea behind offshore wind farms. Instead of trying to squeeze more turbines onto land, where space is limited and people live right beside them, we go out to sea. Out there, the wind is usually stronger, and it tends to show up more consistently. And because the sea gives you room, you can build not just a few turbines, but rows and rows of them, working together like a huge machine. The point isn't one turbine being impressive on its own. The point is scale, lots of turbines, all catching the wind at the same time, turning that moving air into electricity that can actually make a noticeable difference. So, what is an offshore wind farm, in plain terms? It's a big patch of ocean where dozens, or sometimes hundreds, of wind turbines are installed, and they don't work as isolated bits of kit. They're linked together by subsea cables, like a network under the water. Each turbine makes electricity, those cables gather it up, and then the power is sent back to shore to join the grid. If you want a simple image, think of a giant, salty extension lead. You've got lots of plugs, each turbine, feeding into cables that bring everything together, and then one main route takes it back to land. And once the electricity is on shore, it can flow into the same grid that supplies homes, schools, shops, and everything else that needs power day to day. Scotland is a great example because it has two things offshore wind loves: wind and shallow to medium depth seas in many areas. And then further out, there's deeper water that's pushing the next wave of technology. On the fixed bottom side, one well-known project is Sea Green, off the coast of Angus. It's been described as Scotland's largest offshore wind farm, with 114 turbines and 1,075 megawatts of capacity, roughly 27 kilometers offshore. Those numbers matter because they show what large means in real life. It's not just one or two turbines near the coast. It's a full-scale build-out, far enough offshore that you're working in open sea conditions, and big enough that it has to be planned like a serious piece of national infrastructure, not a small local project. Another big Scottish example is Moray East in the Moray Firth, listed at 950 megawatts with 100 turbines. Again, that's the same story of scale, lots of turbines, working together, feeding electricity back to the grid. And Scotland also has a headline-grabbing floating site, Kincardine. It's smaller, 48 megawatts, but it matters because it shows what's possible when the seabed is too deep for traditional foundations. That's an important idea to hold on to. Scotland doesn't just have one type of sea or one type of site. You have places where fixed bottom makes sense, and places where water depth pushes you toward floating wind. When you put those examples side by side, Sea Green, Moray East, and Kincardine, you start to see how offshore wind in Scotland isn't one single thing. It's a mix of projects that suit different parts of the sea. Now, how do we actually build these things? It starts long before you see any turbines. First comes the planning, wind resource studies, seabed surveys, shipping lanes, fishing activity, and environmental assessments. In other words, you don't just turn up and start building. You ask, how strong is the wind here, and how steady is it? What is the seabed like? Where do ships normally travel? Where do fishing boats work? What wildlife and protected areas need to be considered? After that comes the technology choice. In many Scottish sites, turbines are bottom-fixed, attached to foundations on the seabed, like giant steel structures anchored into the ground under the water. For deeper water, you increasingly hear about floating wind, where turbines sit on floating platforms moored to the seabed with lines, more like a boat that stays put than a tower planted in concrete. Once the design is set, construction becomes a huge offshore logistics puzzle. Components are built and brought to port, tower sections, nacelles, blades, and then specialist vessels install foundations, run cables, and lift turbines into place. It's not like building something in a field where trucks can come and go whenever they like. Everything has to be timed, and everything has to move through the same few steps in the right order. When it's done, you've basically got a power station spread across the sea, turbines generating, cables collecting, and a substation, sometimes offshore, sometimes onshore, managing the electricity before it connects into the grid. And the scale makes it even more demanding. If you're installing dozens of turbines, small delays can add up quickly. That's why planning and logistics matter so much, and why this is treated as heavy engineering, not just putting up windmills. At this point, you might be thinking, okay, sounds brilliant, clean energy, loads of wind, what's the catch? And the honest answer is, there are a few. One is cost and complexity. This is a serious engineering project in a tough environment, and the sea does not make things easy. Another is that the sea is already busy. Shipping matters, fishing matters, wildlife matters, and protected areas matter. You can't treat the ocean like an empty space waiting for development. Offshore wind has to fit around other uses and other responsibilities. And in Scotland, one issue comes up again and again because it's so important: seabirds. When you build large rows of turbines in places where birds feed, travel, and breed, you have to take that seriously, because Scotland's seas and cliffs are home to internationally important seabird populations. Offshore wind can affect seabirds in a few ways, and the big three that get discussed are fairly straightforward. First is collision risk, birds flying into turbine blades. Second is displacement, birds avoiding an area and losing feeding grounds. Third is barrier effects, turbines forcing birds to fly around, using extra energy, especially during the breeding season. These concerns are taken seriously in Scottish consenting, particularly where developments could affect protected sites such as SPACE. The key point is that it's not enough to say wind is clean, therefore it's always fine. You still have to look at what changes when you put turbines into a living environment. And because seabirds are a headline issue in Scotland, the consenting process pays close attention to how a project might affect bird populations, especially in relation to protected sites and the times of year when birds are most vulnerable. Some species are flagged more often than others, and one that comes up a lot is the kittiwake. Scottish Government work has noted that kittiwake is among the species most likely to require compensatory measures if further offshore wind developments are consented that would otherwise harm protected populations. In other words, if a project has unavoidable impacts, developers may be required to fund actions that improve outcomes for seabirds elsewhere. That idea is important because it shows how the conversation works in practice. It's not just build versus don't build. Sometimes the question becomes, can the impacts be reduced enough, and if not, what has to be done so that seabird populations are better supported in another way? This doesn't make the issue simple, but it does make it practical. It's a way of recognizing that even clean energy projects can have real effects, and that those effects have to be addressed, not ignored. So what do wind farm developers and regulators actually do about seabirds? It's not just cross your fingers and hope. They start with careful siting, choosing locations and layouts to reduce overlap with key feeding and flight corridors. They use surveys and modeling, and they adjust construction timing to avoid the most sensitive periods where possible. That matters because timing can make a big difference. Some periods are far more sensitive than others, especially around breeding season and when birds are relying heavily on specific feeding grounds. And if impacts still remain significant, Scotland has been exploring strategic ornithological compensation, a more coordinated approach to compensation measures, rather than leaving it as a one-off fix for each project. The overall aim is simple to say, even if it's hard to do: Build the wind farms in ways that reduce seabird impacts as much as possible, and handle what remains in a planned, responsible way. There's also a wider planning layer behind all of this. Scotland's offshore wind pipeline is large. ScotWind was awarded in January 2022 with a headline figure of around 25 gigawatts across multiple sites, a mix of fixed and floating. And Scottish Government marine planning documents keep updating how these option areas are assessed and managed, including environmental constraints. The point is, this isn't random turbine placement. It's a national-scale, planned shift in how energy is produced, and seabirds are one of the headline ecological considerations in that planning. When you hear pipeline, think of it as a lot of projects moving through stages of decision-making. When you hear option areas, think of them as places being considered and managed rather than chosen casually. It's big, organized, and constantly shaped by environmental constraints. If you take one thing away from this, let it be this: offshore wind farms are not just turbines in the sea. They're a blend of meteorology, marine engineering, grid infrastructure, and environmental science. Scotland is a brilliant case study because it's got world-class wind resources and a fast-growing offshore wind sector, and it's got wildlife responsibilities that force the industry to do the hard work properly, especially around seabirds. So next time you see turbines on the horizon, you can think, that's clean power being generated, yes, but it's also a carefully negotiated balance between energy, technology, and nature. And that balance doesn't happen by accident. It happens through planning, consenting, and constant attention to the practical details. Where you build, how you build, and how you manage the impacts along the way.